Looks good. Okay. Thanks for coming. Thank you very much for coming. I wanted to start off, instead of jumping right into part 4, I wanted to ask if anyone had anything from the previous 2 weeks, since we haven't been together. We did part 2, which is Genesis, and we spread that over 2 weeks' time. And so we actually did get as far as Joseph in Genesis when we were last together. But we didn't really cover Joseph, and so I made a video. Hope you're able to see it. But if you have any questions or anything that you want to bring up from that part of the Bible, we can start with that. And then the part from last week is Exodus. So technically today, in a few minutes, we'll start childhood phase of development. We'll start with Joshua and Judges today. But I wanted to first ask if there's anything you wanted to cover in Joseph. I will stir the pot a little bit because it is, after all, my very favorite story in the Bible is Joseph. And one of the reasons why I love it so very much is because it has such a developed reconciliation scene. You have those 12 brothers who were full of jealousy and hatred for Joseph, and that they, especially when Joseph started bragging about those dreams and how everybody was going to bow down to him. And when you're reading that story, you think, wow, he's so blessed and favored. But at the same time, you're thinking, he probably shouldn't have said that, because the brothers get even more upset, and even his parents get upset. What, are we going to bow down to you too? And of course, we know when we read the story, yes, that's exactly what's going to happen. He's just sharing the truth. And his favoring, that he has no real control over when he's favored by God. But that starts the ball rolling with more jealousy. So we get the theme, of course, of the conflict in the brothers. And we've seen it with Cain and Abel, where there was no reconciliation. And then we have it with Jacob and Esau, where there's some reconciliation. And then we have, we did Ishmael and Isaac, where they came back together to for the burial of Abraham. So there was some reconciliation, but they just went their separate ways. And then we had Jacob and Esau, where there was this beautiful reconciliation, but it took 14 years of process for Jacob to learn what it felt like to be deceived. And that difficult, when we're reading that story, it just seems so unfair that Laban would make him work 14 years. Well, maybe God was making him work 14 years, because it really made him a better person. Even when he gets the blessing with Rebecca's Rebecca's encouragement, I should say, when he steals the blessing from his brother, you're still thinking, why is this happening? Why does he get the blessing when it's through deception and lying and trickery? And he's even dishonoring his own father and lying through his teeth at his father's deathbed. I mean, it's not a favorable picture of Jacob at all. We learn that the favoring is not on the worthy. That's what that message is there. God does not favor the worthy. He favors whom he favors, and he equips who he equips to do the will of his plan on the earth. But we do have a reconciliation with Jacob and Esau, and it's only because of that change of heart that Jacob experiences. He's also working for Laban for 14 years, but he receives a great blessing from God. Everything he touches seems to flourish, and that's why Laban doesn't want him to leave. And he's accruing wealth. In fact, when he leaves, he has, through a series of miraculous events that God intervenes, he has many more livestock than Laban would want him to have. He leaves very wealthy, and then when we find out, when he's going straight to Esau to confront Esau and find his brother to make amends, all of that wealth he accrued, turns out, was going to be a gift for Esau. You really get a beautiful, developed picture of reconciliation. Now contrast that with Cain and Abel, and you'll see the development of that theme. Well, Joseph takes it one step further, because all of his brothers wanted him dead. And they had to live with that consequence, by the way. Joseph grows up, so to speak, in Potiphar's house. And so years and years pass. He actually marries and has children. So perhaps 20 years passes while he is in Egypt. His brothers have to come back to Egypt because of a famine. and they are not seeking reconciliation with Joseph because they think he's dead. But Joseph, of course, being so high up in the authority structure of Egypt, they don't recognize him. He's been there for 20 years, so when they left him, he was just a kid, probably just a scrawny 13-year-old or something. And so now he's an adult, and he's completely in the garb of an Egyptian ruler, so they don't recognize him. And so he's in a position where he gets to test them, similar to Laban and Jacob. Laban wasn't doing the testing, God was in that story. But in this story, Joseph gets to be the one to give the tests. And there's several, the silver cup test. Are you going to leave? First of all, is Benjamin okay? Have you left him behind? Do you mistreat Benjamin? Are you going to be jealous of Benjamin? That test happens when the brothers come back and are seated in the room. And it's brilliant. They're seated in birth order in the room when they are to feast with Joseph. And they notice it. They look around and they say, how does he know we're in our birth order? What's going on? And Benjamin is in a seat of honor. And Benjamin gets 5 times as much food as everybody else. And of course they're hungry because the whole point is the famine. And so they're being tested. Joseph is watching their response to see if they say something, if they're rude to Benjamin, if they're jealous of Benjamin. All they do is they notice, and they actually start to argue and talk about how it's been very, very difficult to live with Father, and how it's been terrible to watch him grieve for the past 2 decades. And Joseph hears that and ultimately comes out and says, here I am. I'm Joseph, your brother. But before that happens, I don't know about you, but when I read that story, I'm looking at Judah a lot. Because I'm like, well, I know we're going to have a Lion of Judah. I know Jesus is going to come from one of these sons. And you read the story, and the students do too. They expect it to be who? I mean, who would you expect Jesus to come from? Which one of those 12 sons is favored above all the others? It's absolutely Joseph. And the students are surprised when they find out it's Judah. Why Judah? We have this weird story about Tamar where he's in the wrong, but he says in the end of the story, I can't go into all that detail, it's a great one. In the end of the story with Tamar, he says, you are more righteous than I. And he's talking about a woman. He's talking about a widowed woman. And he says, you are more righteous than I at the end of that story. There's a change of heart for Judah in that story. And so you think, well, maybe that's the key. That change of heart for Judah is so important that that's the one that God is going to choose to be the ascendant of Christ, the favored one. And then at the end of the story, when Benjamin is supposed to come to see Joseph, because you may remember Benjamin's still the youngest, but his father was not interested in sending Benjamin to Egypt. He said, no, I've already lost Joseph. I'm not going to lose Benjamin. It's Judah that talks to his daddy and says, we have to come back with Benjamin or they won't give us Simeon. And Jacob says, I'm sorry, you are not taking Benjamin. And Judah says, I will give you my life if he does not come back. You can kill me. And of course Jacob's like, well, what? Okay, now I'm going to kill my sons? No, thank you. You're not having Benjamin. But he does, I guess part of it's trust in God, but Jacob does relent and let his beloved Benjamin, and it is a beloved Benjamin, because that's the son, the only son left from his beloved Rachel. So his beloved Benjamin he allows to go. But the point is that Judah says he puts his life on the line for his father, for Benjamin. There's a big change of heart there, right? He's the one that was part of that foolishness in the pit with Joseph, right? So when it comes back and Benjamin is present, and Joseph tests them one more time, and he says, okay, fine, you all may go, but leave Benjamin here. Judah says, no, I am not leaving here without Benjamin. You can take me in his place. You can take me in his place. So we have a substitutionary atonement there, and a little precursor, forewarning of Christ himself. So we have a sense that, one more time, God is trying to say, yes, I favor who I favor. They are not necessarily worthy. No man is worthy. No man is worthy. But the one I favor, and I have my reasons. And then we also see that sometimes these tests that humans go through, we see how they may become worthy, and then they receive a blessing. Sometimes it works in that way. In other words, a matter of choice. A matter of choice. So we see that pattern in that Joseph story. There's 12 sons. It's a bit complicated. Some sons we have virtually no information on, but the favoring and the, if you want to call them main characters, there's quite a few out of those 12 that we get a picture of. But what I absolutely love about the Joseph story is that last and final scene where Joseph shows them who he is. And he says, what you intended to harm me, God intended for good. That is a real mature statement. Mm-hmm. There is no retaliation. There's no revenge. There's no, he accepts that God is with him wherever he goes. There's a spiritual maturity here. And when Joseph says, what you intended to harm, God intended for good. That's after they're afraid of retaliation because Jacob has died. They said, well, now Jacob's dead. He's probably going to go after us again. They find it so hard to believe that Joseph can be full of grace. But we know the only way he could be full of grace is because of the favoring of God, that he was given the opportunity, he was given the gift to interpret dreams that brought him up to the palace. God put him in a position so that he could do what is happening now, bless his people. Right? At the end of that story, he's in a position where Israel can come and live in a section of Egypt and be cared for by Joseph. He's that wealthy, he's that powerful, and he's that blessed to be able to bless all of Israel. And that takes us to Exodus. Exodus begins with that story. Unfortunately, all that knew Joseph and Joseph are gone. And the new Pharaoh is upset with the Israelites. You remember why? Remember why the new Pharaoh turns on Israel? He gets a little paranoid. What makes him paranoid? They become too, what?
Numerous.
They become too numerous. That's the only explanation. The new Pharaoh is upset because there's just too many of them. And we're having trouble controlling them. So what do? They enslave them. And that begins the Exodus story. They become slave labor for the Pharaoh, and we are then introduced to Moses and his call story, his birth narrative and his call story. And that's what the video was about last week with Exodus. Again, we have a lot of that birth narrative, the infancy narrative. We have naming and water, and we have a lot of those same motifs come back that we talked about last week. And Exodus, of course, is, I mean, if you look at the book of Exodus, it's basically law and tabernacle. I mean, like a third of it's Moses' narrative, and about a third of it's the law, and about a third of it is the tabernacle and how it's to be instituted. We are in class, we're now talking about Solomon. So we're seeing some parallels to this Moses story pick back up in Solomon, where Solomon has got not the tabernacle to build, but the temple to build. And with him, it's about the wisdom. We have the law, and we have that wisdom. That parallel story happens there. It's lovely. But anyway, so with Exodus, talked a lot about that in the video, but I just want to ask you if there's anything that you want to bring up or if you have any questions. We don't spend a whole lot of time on those 700 laws or so that are in Leviticus and Deuteronomy, but we do talk about them as a whole. And we talk about them in the book as relating to children. You know, Miss Kindergarten teacher, you have a lot of rules. You have a lot of rules. And there's a whole, if you had to actually write them on a board, you could fill them up. But in my classroom, we would basically have maybe 4 or 5 rules we have to remind ourselves of. But all of those rules, thank you that you taught those students in kindergarten. And first and second and third grade, those are the ones that by the time they get to us in middle school, they've got. And so we can start focusing on higher, more internal development rules, moral development, right? How your actions affect other people is what we are able to work with, because we've already got the sharpening of the pencils and raise your hand before you talk, hopefully.
You can write them down, but they couldn't read them, so it's kind of pointless.
You can write them down, but they can't read them. Well, it reminds you of them.
That's right.
But they have to live. It's true. They have to live, learn by doing. Learn by doing, and they make tons of mistakes. And that's a lot of what you see in Exodus. You know, and what's important too is a lot of the complaining that we talked about when Moses crosses the Red Sea and they're in the wilderness. A lot of that happens before they even get the law. You know, which is kind of like you're saying. You know, you're trying to teach them these rules before they can even read. It's kind of like that. They're going to make a lot of mistakes because of their immaturity, and they're not able to. Well, they weren't able to read them either.
And in the Bible, it lists all these rules about people are supposed to live by. I mean, I read them sometimes, and I'm like, I was amazed at how many people, how they could remember all these rules to live by. I mean, I'm thinking, I'd have been a befuddled mess because I couldn't have remembered a tenth of them, but I mean.
But you think about, I appreciate that, I think about that too. Think about all the things that you have learned in your preschool to, say, 10th grade or 11th grade. All the information you learned there that they wouldn't be learning. You know, you have a formal education. You spend 8 hours a day, well, maybe 6 hours a day, actually learning facts and information, whereas they were learning, if they were following God, the stories of God. So they would be committed to memory, they would be oral tradition, and they wouldn't be written down for a very, very long time. Moses is given credit for writing it down, because the Bible does refer to him writing down the law. So, I mean, I'm not going to get technical about who wrote it down, but the point is that it clearly, even the Bible itself will attest that none of it was written down until Moses. So the story of Joseph, the story of Jacob and Esau, going back to Abraham, all of that would have been an oral tradition. And then, in theory, Moses would have written it all down, if that's indeed the way it worked. But at least he wrote down the law on scrolls, because they do talk about referencing the laws on scrolls. But yes, there were people whose life was dedicated to memorizing large chunks of the information, and God himself tells them that they are supposed to share that with their generation after generation. And sometimes they don't, and God doesn't like that, of course, because once again, it's about disobedience and obedience. That's one of the major themes of this portion of the Bible, as evidenced by the primacy of the law. And as I said, when you sit there and try to count them, and I have not, but other people have, you try to count them, the range is like 643, sometimes up to 700 laws that are in the Torah. And yes, how can you keep that straight? But there's a purpose there. When you have that many laws, why do you have that many rules in kindergarten? It keeps them a little bit out of trouble. They're talking about the rules. They're saying, wait, you're supposed to be over here. They're straightening each other out. And even if you had a class behind a screen, we couldn't see them, but you were walking down the hall or we could hear them, we would probably know they were kindergartners by what they were saying, by the conversation. They are preoccupied with their shoelaces, or they're preoccupied with being in a straight line, or they are saying things like crisscross applesauce. When we hear them talk about the rules, we can actually place their maturity level, because they're operating on rules that are that basic. And I think that can be analogous to our 10 Commandments. Those laws are that basic. There's a reason why those 10 Commandments are pretty much universal on the planet. There are others, like for example, incest is pretty much universal around the planet, that aren't technically in the 10 Commandments, but they are later in the other rest of the law. There's quite a few laws like that are just universal. But then there's very specific laws about which animal they can eat, you know, whether it's a cloven hoof or not. Those very specific dietary laws would also serve, some of them are clearly sanitary issues and benefit them with their health. But some of them, you can't dismiss that easily as a health issue. They seem to be drawing unity within their people. This is what we do. This is what the people outside of us don't do, but this is what we do. And one of those, of course, would be circumcision. They know who they are by whether or not they have been circumcised. They know who they are by whether or not they're allowed to eat shrimp or whatever. You see what I'm saying? That brings them together, and those conversations around the table, whether it happens 2 or 3 times a day, are going to perpetuate those rules and norms. They're learning them. And that is part of what keeps them as a unique people. Okay? So there's childhood, obedience, disobedience. That's Exodus. I hate to shortchange it, but I gave you a whole video. In fact, I went on and on about that. That video was a little long. I'm sorry. It's about an hour. I was surprised it was that long. But today's part 4. Unless there's anything else, any questions or anything you want to bring up from Joseph or Exodus, the Moses narrative, is there anything else that you want to touch on? Then let's go to part 4. This is Joshua and Judges, childhood. It's kind of difficult in some ways to differentiate between infancy and childhood, except for this. If I were asking you the stages of life today, or actually you could open up a psychology book and look at the stages of life today, it would include a nice little section called youth or adolescence. But it's interesting, when I found this out, I was like, wow, this really works with my book. Thank you, God. I found out that there's no word for adolescence in Hebrew. There's no word for that unique, what we consider in modern times to be a unique time when you're neither child nor adult. There is no word in Hebrew, in the Bible, now I'm sure there is now, but in the Bible there's no word for adolescence or what we would consider to be that section of life between. Because here's the thing, we call it adolescence because it is there are changes that occur that allow you to reproduce after that, right? Well, so you're an adult. Before that, you're a child, right? And so, we have ancient examples of children not really being children, is like King Tut being a king when he's 9 years old. You know, they had high expectations for their children who are able, if they're able to cook, they cooked. If they're able to move water, they moved water. If they were able to defend the family, they defended the family. If they were able to shepherd flocks, they shepherded flocks. So it's interesting. I share this with my students because I say, I have a secret. I said, I know that you are capable of more than your parents expect of you. Because we keep you young for a very long time. We keep you in the house. We keep you from a driver's license, for example, until you're 16. But we all know it wasn't that long ago. Probably our grandparents all drove long before they were 16. They probably drove a tractor without any sort of belt. So you get the idea. Yes, farm equipment is dangerous times. Well, if that was true for our grandparents, then how much more so, 3,000 years ago. So we have this theme of childhood, but we have to look through the lens of the culture of the Bible, and that is that childhood would really truly be the age all the way up to adolescence. And what does that mean then? Well, if you think about childhood in the Bible, I gave these first verses at the beginning of the chapter here on page 59 and 60. I think of the faith of a child. It's actually a very positive representation when it's used in the Bible. A child, there's 2 uses of child, right? Like, I am the child of my parents, but what we're actually talking about is the age of childhood. So the age of childhood is actually marked as an example of great faith. The issue is trust. And by the way, it's one of the things, I majored in psychology. One of the things I love about this is because you actually can open up a psychology book, look at moral development, look at physical development, maturity of a human being, and they observe this as well, is that there is trust versus distrust is marked in Erickson's developmental theory. But here we have it, as is obedience and disobedience, incidentally. So I borrowed a little bit of that. Or at least it was in there and it said, wow, the Bible's doing the same thing. We can watch this in our children. They have rules, they break the rules, but then you see child as they grow up, they are not yet ready for independence that will come with adulthood, but they're looking and following the lead of their parent, and that is an issue of trust. And in a healthy situation, they would trust their parent and do pretty much whatever they asked. And that is why the child in the Bible is the example of faith. Why Abraham is not a child. He's an adult. In fact, he's old, right, in that story, in his 90s. But he's the example of childlike faith. Okay? So he has that faith of trust. In fact, below the surface is the implication that the older you get, maybe the harder it is to trust God. But Abraham, the opposite. Right? Brilliant stuff. I love it. So, we don't have a word for teenager and adolescent. Don't look for that in our developmental stages. It made me very happy because it made my stages number 7 instead of 8. So that made me very happy. But that's what we're looking at in Joshua and Judges. Well, let me ask you a question. What comes to mind with Joshua? What do you remember about his story, or when you think about Joshua, what comes to mind? I don't need to pop quiz you. I'm just asking if you remember.
Jericho.
Yeah, Joshua's the story of Jericho. And and that's actually multi-layered there, because we get Rahab in that story, and we have God reaching out beyond his people, because Rahab made a decision to choose and follow God, and God accepted that.
Right.
So she is, and it's not lost on us, she's also a woman. So she has a very special place in this part of the story narrative, because she is choosing Yahweh. We also had a couple of examples along the way where Shechem and his people were going to be converted if they had wanted to be converted. So we knew the conversion was possible to follow God. They just had to be circumcised. We had that little example. But with Rahab, it's remarkable because she's a woman. Obviously, she cannot become part of Israel by circumcision. But yet she makes a decision to do that. It is her faith that saves not only her, but her whole household. So it's an exciting example. So thank you for bringing up Jericho. And of course, the walls tumbling down is all God. But why does it happen? How does it happen? They follow the rules exactly. Obedience and trust. By the way, there's trust there, because they're walking right around the wall. If there is an easy place to get picked off, it's right next to the wall of your enemy. They can throw a chair on you, you're dead. You know what I'm saying? So there was a lot of trust going around and marching around and following the directions perfectly. And then, of course, the miracle happens that they all witness with Jericho. And one more time, we're feeling for the people in this, and I think rightly so, because we're on the other side of Christ. We feel for the people who are not included in God's protection and provision, the people of Jericho. But yet we have this example of Rahab. They could have chosen to follow God. Rahab had heard the stories. That's why she had faith. She had heard the stories of the Red Sea. Another connection, Red Sea reminds me of it, is Joshua is so parallel to Moses. It is one of the great things you get when you read the Bible cover to cover, or when you read books cover to cover. Because I've never read the Bible. I've never read the whole Bible through, but I've read Bible books cover to cover, and then you see these themes come back. You can't read Joshua's call story without thinking of Moses. You feel like all they did was erase Moses' name, put Joshua in there. I mean, he doesn't have. He has a remove your sandals, for the place you're standing is holy ground. So that's completely lifted right from Moses' story. But that happens to Joshua. It's verifying his role. It's verifying his role as the new leader. And then, if that didn't strike you, then having Joshua go to the Jordan and have the Jordan separate and him walk across it on dry land, that's there for a reason too. God is saying, Joshua is my new commander, and all of Israel is witnessing that handoff to the new commander that's favored by God. It's good stuff. So, what else? Anything else about Jericho or Joshua? I do mention circumcision a little bit in this chapter. My students are always kind of, when I explain to them what it is, their face always screws up like, what? what? Why in the world circumcision? What do you think about that? Of all the ways, I mean, God could have made a forehead tattoo, I guess. He could have come up with some other way for Israel to be marked as his people. Why do you think circumcision?
Because it couldn't be undone. Like, once it happened, like, it couldn't be reversed.
That's it's definitely permanent. That's exactly right. It's yeah, I think that is definitely part of it.
What was the age? I was trying to think that when they're older, as far as in age, than what we would do for our children. Well, I mean, we did for our boys. I mean, we have a choice.
Right. Well, circumcision, as God decreed it, was
Right.
an 8-day infant.
Okay.
It was an infant at 8 days.
Okay.
There were exceptions, like folks who were converted. There was also the exception of the first circumcision, which would have been Abraham and his son Ishmael. And he, of course, would have been about 13.
Okay.
And Abraham, of course, would have been in his 90s or more. Very, very old man. But it brings up a point. I don't know if we can fully appreciate this, but I can imagine what it would be like to have to be circumcised as an adult, just from the wimpy stuff I hear my husband say. It's not something that a man is going to submit to without a very serious reason, without a serious life-death commitment. And so I appreciate that. When I give it some thought, I consider, and it's tough to think about in 2020 because we are so modest as a culture. We have this just built into us, what's okay to talk about, what's not. But at any rate, remember, it is marking the seed of the human. It's not like I said, they could have put a mark on the forehead. But what God is doing is he is placing a sign on the source of his first commandment to be fruitful and multiply. It is not a coincidence, it's a reproductive organ, is what I'm trying to say. And it is not about, see, we think, well, children do too, because of our culture, we think penis, we think sex. But that is so, I don't believe at all the point. It's an 8-day-old infant. The idea is that God is saying, these are my people. People, plural. Today, tomorrow, and next millennia, my people. And how is that going to be propagated but through the seed of his people? And so the sons become, of course, fathers. And they are obviously part of the covenant of circumcision. Obviously, women are not able to become a part of that. That's one of the reasons why Christ's coming was so important. But here we have in Joshua Rahab as an example. I mean, it hadn't been that long since we just instituted circumcision, but yet we have Rahab as an example. She jumps off the page of how a woman can become part of God's family, right? So I appreciate there is a balance there already this early in the history of Israel. So I appreciate that question, and I hope it helps. We have a lot more we could say about conflict resolution. We see the development of what does it take to resolve a conflict? I want to ask you that. What does it take to resolve a conflict? All of y'all have been in a conflict. You've probably had to mediate, I know. If you have children, you've had to mediate a conflict. What does it require? What is a, I guess what I'm saying is that, I'll give you an example. With little bitty children, you say you're sorry. And you say you're sorry. Now hug and make up, right? You make them do it. It's an external, observable thing. But that's not where we need to stay, okay? If adults are doing that because they're being made to do that, that's not true resolution. It's certainly not to mature adults. So what does it take for that?
Open mind,
Say again?
open mind,
Okay.
understanding.
for the situation and what's going on.
Yeah, open mind, understanding for the situation that's going on. Perhaps there needs to be a conversation so that I can imagine what you're going through, and you can imagine what I'm going through. I mean, that's kind of the road to mature conflict resolution, right?
They have to have the ability to listen.
Yeah.
Listening is very
They
important
listen,
of that.
They can't work it out.
Well, I'm sure
They
you
can't
have
share.
experience with
If
that.
they can't share and they can't listen, then they can't work it out.
Right. And then what? You either force it or you just wait and hope they mature to the point where they can have empathy. In the Bible, the conflict resolution as a developing theme, we see the faith of the forgiver in Joseph, for example. He was able to forgive fully because of his faith. He saw the bigger picture. He wasn't just thinking about, they threw me in a pit. They sold me to Ishmaelite traders. He could think beyond that. And he could realize that there was a bigger picture, that's God. So there's the faith of the forgiver. And then we also have the repentance of the offender. The repentance, the idea of saying, I'm sorry, I recognize the part that I did that was wrong. And isn't that the foundation of God's relationship with us? Right? God is merciful and giving and forgiving. And we need to recognize that, or confess our sin and repentance, and then we will have that relationship restored. It is not a surprise when you read, as much as we have, that there's something going on with these brothers and in conflict, and that there is a development of forgiveness that grows and strengthens and matures in the course of the pages of the Bible. Well, the next logical question is, why do we care? What is it here? What's God trying to say? He's trying to show and model for us how we should behave toward one another. We are all brothers and sisters. And he's also modeling the relationship we have with him to be restored when we sin against him. Right? That's important to God. So it shows up again and again and again and again. And not only that, it's developed. Because as we mature, we should also be able to more fully forgive and more fully repent and more fully be humble and appreciate what our role was. Hopefully, we would even give more mercy to people who don't know God, because we're thankful we do. Okay? That's some good stuff. That's some good stuff to pick up in Genesis and Exodus. Don't tell me there's no forgiveness in the Old Testament. You're not reading the same book I am. It's there. It's beautiful. I just wanted to read on page 63 some questions there that get at what I'm trying to say here. We're trying to develop from a self-centered a self-centered point of view to a relationship-centered point of view. What do we do when we face conflict and our parents aren't there? Do we seek to restore the relationship that's been broken? Do we recognize God as wanting us to be restored in that relationship with our brother or our neighbor? Do we act on that understanding? When we recognize our wrong, do we choose to avoid that person to protect our sense of pride? Or do we seek them out and humbly admit our fault for the purpose of restoring that relationship that's important to us? I think we all see that in our lifetime. These are some of the hallmarks of moral development in a young adult or an adult. Maturity does not necessarily come with age. Our intentions and actions determine our ethics and our morality, not our chronological age. But the Bible is trying to lay that process out for us. I will just say briefly that the conquest of Canaan is obviously in Joshua and Judges, and it is a difficult series of chapters to read when God tells his people, wipe out all the people in this land that I have given you. We do discuss that in my class, and to the extent that they're able to receive it, I do share with them, this is a difficult section. If you go to college and you talk to people who are outside the faith, they may, I would not be surprised, point to this section in the Bible as something abhorrent and unacceptable to them. And I don't want a God that does that kind of thing. I don't necessarily address that answer perfectly. I don't think any human being really can. But it is interesting to read people who try. But I will simply say that I liken it to your mom or your dad. And when there's a kid across the street you've grown up with, I'm going to focus on Rachel because she's my student in the room. There's a kid across the street you grew up with, and over time your parents find out that that kid is on drugs. They're doing drugs. They're doing all sorts of mess. And so your parents are like, you know what? We're not going to hang around that person anymore. You can't hang around. I don't want to see you hang around that person anymore. And you'll be like, but I love them. You know, I see her on the bus and I love her. And I said, well, that is fine. I love that you love her. But we're going to pray for her. I want her to get as much help as she possibly can from the right people, but you're not that help. You're not equipped, and you're not gifted that way. I don't want you around that. And that's kind of the best way I can convey this Canaanite conquest. It's not perfectly adequate, but on that level, it's not a bad example. God knows that if his people are around and intermarry with those Canaanites, they will follow Baal, Ashereth, Ashtart, El, these other pagan gods. And, you know, we keep reading ahead. That's exactly what they do anyway. But they would have done it sooner, or they would have lost, because we don't even have the whole book, we don't even have the whole Bible yet. They would have lost the book of God had they been completely unfaithful to God sooner. So there you go. That's a big one. I mean, you can write a long book on just the conquest of Canaan and what it means or why it's there or if it actually happened or whatever. You might find out about that part of the Bible. But I do mention to you and to them, this is Israel's history, from Israel's point of view. Just like when I'm raising my boys, that's my kids, and I'm doing what's best for them, ultimately. So, not easy, but moving on. Let's see. We've got to get into a little bit more here. Samson. I can't miss Samson. Samson's a great example of a child. You read Samson and you're just thinking to yourself, why? Do you think it stopped? Why is this guy a judge? Why do everybody think he's a good guy? You know, he's a mess. He makes impetuous decisions. He makes seemingly self-centered decisions. He's arrogant. He's a braggart. It gets him in trouble. We're like, what? Is he a hero? What is so heroic about Samson? Nothing. Very little is heroic about Samson until the end. And what's wonderful about, because I know my time is short here, but what's wonderful about every major character in the Bible and many minor characters in the Bible is that the heroes we consider Bible heroes, each one of them, the best parts of them, create a composite of a great person, and that becomes Christ, right? Each one of those heroes has something great. You know, Moses is the great prophet. And of course, Samson, he self-sacrifices himself at the end. He redeems himself at the end through death. He sacrifices himself to defeat the evil Philistines, or the people who were hanging out in Dagon's temple at the time. And it is the self-sacrifice of Samson that redeems himself at the end. And of course, that's another piece to the puzzle, the tapestry, if you will, or the stained glass window, that creates the full picture of the Messiah that's to come. But again, his moral development is a child. He's self-centered. He's easily taken by a woman, like you would expect an adolescent or a young boy to be. Yes, he's a picture of rebellion, arrogance, and self-centeredness. And yet, at the end of the story, we realize why he is named as a Bible hero by the Bible itself in Hebrews. But he's one of them named. He has a maturity at the end. I want to just take a minute before we close to see if there's any of these discussion questions that you want to discuss, particularly that maybe something in your reading that stood out to you, or anything else that you want to address. We did talk about Rahab here. The Moses and Joshua parallels are pretty clear in the text, in my book anyway, and in the text of the Bible. And why was the Lord angry with Israel? Do you have kids? Do you ever get angry? Is it just me? Yes, that's a marker for childhood as well. God gets so angry with Moses, he says he's burning with anger and he's going to kill him. And Zipporah steps in, his wife steps in. It's a weird couple paragraphs. I don't fully understand it, but she's the reason why he is allowed to live. Which is another, I always have to put in my women here, because the Bible just does seem so one-sided. It's a patriarchal society, it's the culture it's in. But those women are there. Even 5,000 years prior to now, those women are there because God knew where it was going to go. He knew where it was going to end up. So yeah. Okay, so any questions or anything? How about feedback? Just how's it going? I mean, is it...
I found it interesting, and I don't know if it's because I'm so close to like the infant, toddler, child years, that it's like, that's so how we treat God and those, you know, because I think it was the last chapter, but you talked about how you tell a toddler, no, don't do that. They go right around and do it. And that's what we do. It's that lack of trust and faith. And we're like, well, I'm just going to do it this way, God, anyway. And then we'll see how it turns out, you know. So I don't know if it's just because I am in the midst of, you know, raising little children at the moment, but it is quite that comparison. Like, I get that.
It is the perfect metaphor that will never go away.
Yeah.
As long as we keep having children, we will understand why. Well, we will understand what God is trying to convey through these stories, because they are all about relationships. You know? Thank you for that. It also shows how dependent a child is on its parent.
Yes.
That's the model. We are dependent on God.
Yeah.
It's really the perfect metaphor. We shouldn't be surprised, right? It's the perfect metaphor, but it really is. And I think it's probably one of the strongest examples of God the Creator. Like, I didn't really create my child, but in a sense, God let me do it in that sense. Anything else? Oh, thanks, guys. Okay, next week, God willing, we'll be here. Adulthood. Oh, goodness. But cool, because this is David, this is Solomon, but it's all the kings. So it starts off well and goes downhill quick. But anyway, that's where we're going next week, is adulthood. And not to depress any adults in here, but next is death. Sorry, just letting you know ahead of time. All right. Well, if you don't mind, we will close in prayer on that note. Dear Lord Jesus, thank you so much for just the weather and our being able to be together. I know we're missing some folks this week. I pray that you bring, that they will benefit from the video and just bring them back to us next week, and just let us all catch up on some things that we have going on in our lives. But I thank you for your text and for the opportunity for us to discuss it together and to grow in faith and in knowledge, as we will hopefully know what the Bible says and have confidence in what it says and doesn't say, so that we can be a valid witness, an accurate witness to what it says to our children and to those we come in contact with that you bring into our lives. So I thank you for that, Father, and I thank you again for each and every person in here and for all of the preparation that they have done, large or small. I just thank you for them being here. In Jesus' name I pray. Amen. Thank you, ladies.
Thank you.
Okay.